Okay, we're going to start up with oligopolies. There is a pure oligopoly and a differentiated oligopoly, and they're fairly similar in terms of the number of firms. You have 4 to 6 firms in this particular industry or this market that dominate between 75 and 80% of the market share. There can be other firms in there, but they really have no impact on the market. Type of product sold in a pure oligopoly is the products are homogeneous. So when you look at steel, it doesn't matter what company you buy it from, it's exactly the same. And the same is with aluminum. They have a homogeneous product, they are exactly the same. In a pure oligopoly and a differentiated oligopoly, the conditions of entering these particular markets very difficult to enter. So there are substantial barriers to entry, but there are some barriers to exit too. When we look at the automobile industry, the government stepped in and bailed out GM. They also did some things to get Fiat to buy Chrysler because they realized because there are so few of these car companies, by taking one out, it would have devastated the economy. So not only is it difficult to get into the automobile industry, but the government also thinks it's important that we keep those businesses and keep people working. So they made it difficult for them to go out of business. Control over price is determined by the market, and there typically are price leaders in these types of industries, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Non-price competition, because you are looking at identical products, so it would be difficult to compete on price. Everyone must pretty much sell it for the same price. So what they do is they try to promise earlier delivery, things like that, to get you to purchase from them. Differentiated oligopoly is very similar to a pure oligopoly. You still have 4, 5, 6 who dominate in this particular industry, but the difference is that the type of product they sell, instead of being homogeneous or identical, they differentiate them, like in the car industry, the cereal industry, those sorts of things. Once again, still very difficult to get into them and very difficult to get out of these industries. Startup costs, very expensive, technology, amount of control that these existing companies already have. They do have non-price competition, though. If you look at the price of cars, you can get some very cheap, and then you can get some that are hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some specific terms that you need to know about an oligopoly. There's this idea of interdependence, and this means that each firm must take into account the likely reactions of other firms in the market when making pricing and investment decisions. So if you only have 3 or 4 or 5 firms total in a particular industry, whenever they're making certain decisions on pricing and things to do, they always have to remember that there's only a couple other firms out there, and what they do will likely have an effect on the other ones. So there is some interdependence between those, and they make decisions based on how other firms are going to react in that industry. When you have industries like perfectly competitive industry, where you have farming, where there are thousands and thousands, they really don't have to worry about what the other guys are doing. But in this one, there are so few, there is a lot of interdependence. Collusion is another thing that can sometimes take place in an oligopoly. And what you basically have here is when firms work together and agree to make pricing decisions and supply decisions. So colluding is when 2 different companies get together and they can really act like a monopoly by setting those prices. Going back to a price leader, typically, once again, because of this idea of interdependence, when one firm has a dominant position in the market, they can make decisions that the others tend to follow. So the firms with lower market shares have to follow what the dominant firm does, or they're going to lose market share. So if a dominant firm lowers price, if these other firms, because there's only 3 or 4, don't follow, then they can really lose some market share. Price wars happen when companies continuously lower their price to try and undercut competition. And a price war may be used to increase revenue in the short term or as a long-term strategy to gain market share. So you have this predatory pricing sometimes that takes place where a business will set prices below cost in order to drive out the competition. And if you've got a lot of cash on hand, you can hold out and keep your prices low. Then what you will do is as soon as you've driven everyone out of the market, then at the end of that, then you can actually raise your prices back up again. So a price war in the short run is good for the consumer, but in the long run, when a price war actually is able to get rid of competition, eventually those prices will go back up and maybe sometimes higher. Cartels are something that's also associated with an oligopoly, and in the United States, cartels are illegal. And then going back to collusion in the United States is also illegal. But a cartel is a combination of independent business organizations formed to regulate production, pricing, and marketing of goods by the members. We don't have any cartels in the United States, but one that you might be familiar with is OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And basically, you have all of these Middle Eastern countries, and there are a few who aren't in the Middle East. Venezuela, obviously, is not in the Middle East. But what they do is they act kind of like a monopoly, and they set pricing and they set supply levels in order to get the highest price for their product. And these are actually the member nations of OPEC. You don't need to memorize them, but I thought you might be interested. All of these countries, and there are 12 of them, make up OPEC. And they really are the driving force behind gas prices because they control, for the most part, the oil industry. Cartels only survive if members keep to their agreement. And there's usually an incentive to cheat, and they usually don't last because of this cheating, because sometimes you have non-members out there who are also able to offer lower costs. So typically what happens is OPEC will meet. They will set supply levels lower than what most of these nations are able to supply. And once the price starts to go up because supply has been decreased, there is an incentive for them to cheat and actually put their oil into the market so they could take advantage of the higher prices. Well, the other members see that happening, and they want to get their oil into the market too before the price starts to come down. Well, as more oil enters the market, the price starts to come down. So then they have to have another meeting and try and get the supply to go back down so they can raise the price. Russia is not a member of OPEC, but they have huge quantities of oil in their country, and so oftentimes they try and negotiate with other countries, and that can also affect prices. When we look at this demand curve, this is the demand curve that usually represents an oligopoly. And what we have here, it's called a kinked demand curve. And what we see here at the top part of the kink is where demand is more elastic, and at the bottom it's more inelastic. And so what typically happens is when a firm in an oligopoly, because of price leadership, lowers its price, that's represented by the bottom portion where it's more inelastic because everyone tends to have to follow or they're going to lose market share. So if the automobile industry, they lower the price, and if you were buying a Chrysler, if Chrysler lowers, let's say GM lowers its price and you want to purchase Chrysler most of the time. But when GM lowers its price, you might have an incentive to purchase a General Motors car. Chrysler knows that, so they have to follow suit, and they also will lower their price, which means if everyone's lowering their price, then we are going to continue to buy what we were buying before because there's really no incentive to change. Above the kink is when you have a price leader who raises the price, and no one follows them in raising the price, which means they're going to be very sensitive to a change in price. People will no longer buy a GM, they will buy Chrysler. Let's say GM raises the price, Chrysler either leaves theirs the same or actually could even lower it. You're going to have a lot of people, unless they are extremely brand loyal, who might be tempted or given an incentive to switch. So above, where it's more elastic, is looking at price leadership, where a leader raises the price and no one follows, so you're going to see a decrease, fairly significant, in the quantity demanded for their product. Down below, where it's more inelastic, we're seeing a price leader raise the price. Everyone else follows, which gives you no incentive to take advantage of the leader's decrease because you will continue to buy from who you bought before.